Let's now proceed with the session 9, titled Powering the Grid, Unraveling Change, Cost, and Flexibility in Distribution System. So before we begin, I want to acknowledge the financial support of Toronto Hydro, the sponsor of this session. If you happen to meet Julia McNeely, you've met her yesterday, please extend your gratitude for their generous support. C'est un plaisir pour moi maintenant d'inviter notre prochaine modératrice, la professeure Anan Dagdougui, professeure au département de mathématiques de génie industriel à la Polytechnique Montréal. Ses recherches se concentrent sur la modélisation, la prévision et l'optimisation des systèmes énergétiques, avec un grand intérêt pour l'application de l'optimisation mathématique et de l'apprentissage automatique au réseau intelligent. De plus, Anan est une membre estimée de notre conseil consultatif au Carrefour, donc veuillez vous joindre à moi pour applaudir chaleureusement Anan alors qu'il nous rejoint sur scène.
Bon après-midi à tous. Donc, je vais faire commencer comme Normand l'aime bien en français. Bon après-midi à tous et à toutes. Donc, il me fait plaisir aujourd'hui de vous introduire la session 9, l'avant-dernière session d'aujourd'hui qui va se concentrer sur le renforcement du réseau à travers les changements dans les coûts et aussi dans la partie flexibilité, l'ajout de flexibilité dans le réseau. Donc, good afternoon everyone. So, I'm happy to introduce you to the 9th session about powering the grid through the unveiling changes, costs, and flexibility in distribution network. So during this session, we'll be focusing more on the how to increase the flexibility in distribution system through adding more renewables, through also understanding of challenges related to renewable energy system and also storage system. So we'll also highlight how load forecasting can play and can assist grid for planning infrastructure investment and particularly for electrification. And finally, we'll focus also on some financial aspects regarding distribution system evolvement. So for that, we have 1 hour and 15, and I will be happy to invite my speakers, 5 speakers for this panel on stage. So our first speaker, Véronique Delist, project manager in the Renewable Energy Integration Program at Calmet Energy. We have also Amara Slaymaker, associate consultant at Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors. And we have also Professor Takonit, professor in sustainable energy engineering at Simon Fraser University, with his student Pierre McWellner, PhD student at the same university. And finally, we have Caroline Talwell, so hopefully I pronounced the name correctly, Chief Corporate Services Officer and General Counsel at Ontario Energy Board. So we have about 1 hour and 15 minutes for this very interesting topic, very interesting panel. So to start, I would like to invite our first presenter, Véronique Delist. So she will be focusing more on the providing us an overview of distributed energy resources and discussing some innovative approaches to plan that goes beyond the static load consideration. So welcome to Véronique.
All right, so I will be just talking about, or maybe get us thinking of new ways to integrate distributed energy resources in planning to better consider the flexibility that they can bring. So I'll provide a bit of context, and then I'll talk about those considerations of the flexibility of distributed energy resources, and I'll also provide some examples of what type of flexibility they can bring. So you've probably seen this graphic yesterday. So it illustrates the traditional grid. So what is the traditional grid? So it's the flow of power that's mostly unidirectional from generation to transmission to distribution. It's also, the communication is also mostly unidirectional. So the components of the grid don't necessarily talk to one another. The generation assets are mostly centralized. There are decentralized assets, of course, but they're mostly centralized and dispatchable. We can control the output. So in the traditional grid, we really have the mindset of supply follows demand continuously, instantaneously. The load profile, they cannot really be controlled by the system operator. They can be influenced with incentives, with time of use, but they're mostly not controlled, they are what they are. Variable renewable energy penetration on the distribution side exists, of course, but still limited because of its impact on operations. And it's really considered most of the time as a negative load. And within the actual framework, well, the grid is reliable and we're able to keep the power on. Our modernized grid, our grid of the future is different. It's cleaner, more clean generation sources, more renewables, more variable renewable also. So more wind, more solar. The grid of the future or near future is also smarter. So we have more bidirectional communication between the different components of the grid. We also have better monitoring of and better control of the grid that allows us to do more things. And loads and inverter-based resources can not only provide grid support, but they can do it in an automated way. So the modernized grid hopefully is still reliable and we're still able to keep the power on, but it's also hopefully more resilient, so better response to unforeseen events, and maybe we shift a bit our mindset when it comes to resiliency from the bulk system resiliency to more local. And the more modernized grid is also potentially more efficient, so we have a better utilization of the assets of the network because we enable DERs to participate. So let's take a minute here to define distributed energy resources because it's not always defined the same way. So sometimes we see it includes generators and energy storage technologies on the distribution side. Sometimes it only includes electric power sources. But here what we will use as our preferred definition is any resources. So we include generation, we include storage, and we include controllable loads on the medium voltage and distribution voltage side. So what does that include? Well, smart thermostats that control electric baseboard heaters, heat pumps, smart controllers that control electric water heaters or any other loads, solar PV systems on the distribution side, batteries, and EVs. And why are DERs important? Because they can provide flexibility. And what is flexibility? Is the ability to adapt to grid changes, so to grid needs, and commit to shifting the active and or reactive power to help to provide that service. And the services are numerous. So you have compensating for phase unbalance, maintaining distribution voltage or frequency within range, maintaining operation during faults, balancing reactive power flow, and balancing real power flow in normal operation and during contingency. And that last one is in bold because it's important because when we're doing a capacity expansion planning model, we're actually balancing real power flow either for the full year or for certain weeks or for certain days. And we do that and we try to find the system of the future at the least cost. So if DERs can provide flexibility and can help balancing real power flow, it would make sense to try to capture that in long-term planning. So how do we currently do it? So let's look at the three components of DERs. So starting with distributed generation. Well, right now, distributed generation, if it's significant, we'll consider it, again, by using the concept of net load, so load minus distributed generation. That net load is time and resource dependent, so it changes, but it's an input, it's static, it's passive. Distributed storage, well, if it's significant, we'll include it with aggregating it at the closest bus. And we will somewhat consider the performance characteristics. When it comes to load, well, the load, of course, is time dependent, but it's also typically an input that will remain static throughout the simulation. We'll often adjust it in pre-processing, accounting for demand response, but often that will be only at the peak. We'll say, okay, well, that much demand response will help the peak, so we will adjust the load curve in pre-processing and then use that. We won't account for the fact that it can actually vary throughout the simulation, for example, to balance variable renewable energy. So capturing the ability of DER to balance power flow in long-term planning, well, it's done in a certain way, but it's not complete. So let's look at some examples of the type of flexibility that it can give. So let me start with some examples of inverter-based resources. So inverter-based resources on the distribution side or on the transmission side also, but convert DC current into AC current, right? And they can be connected on both sides, as I just said, and they include solar PV systems, battery system, EVs. And if we just look at the CR 2023 Energy Future Report, the total solar expected capacity, well, about 30% of that would be rooftop systems, so system on the distribution side, right? So inverter-based resources like solar PV on the distribution side, they will be there. So this is an example from South Australia Power Networks. So they have a very unique system. 68% of their demand was met by solar and wind in 2022. Just to give you an idea, in Canada, solar wind combines about 6-7%. Their target in 2028 is to reach 100%. So they have one out of 3 customers with a rooftop solar system. So that's 350,000 rooftop solar systems and 30,000 batteries. And at 1 p.m. on October 1st, well, 100% of their demand was met by rooftop solar. And it's interesting to look at that curve because they also use the concept of net demand, so demand minus solar. But how were they able to achieve that? Because if they would have just let everybody interconnect with no limitations, let's say, they would have had congestion on their network. So to prevent that congestion, they look at different options. One of them would be upgrading their infrastructure to avoid that congestion, limiting the excess generation from the grid. So saying, you are able to interconnect, but you cannot feed more than 1.5 kilowatt, let's say, at all times. The third solution that they looked at and that they actually went for was what they call the flexible export. Export here being feeding back to the grid. So that was basically allowing them to interconnect, but the system operator had the opportunity to, according to network condition, limit the amount of electricity that could be feed back into the grid because of smart and internet-connected inverters. So what does that mean is that DERs, they have the flexibility to modulate their output. Of course, they can provide other services, but they can modulate their output. So if we ignore that in long-term planning, we might get an optimization model that will want to overbuild infrastructure to remove congestion or limit the amount of PV that's being built. Another example that you've probably seen before is that one from Summerside Electric that are actually using electric thermal storage units and electric water heaters to balance excess wind. So in order to capture that, you need which are controllable loads. You need to take into account that these loads are dynamic. So this shows the importance of considering that, because otherwise you cannot capture something like that. So is it significant? So I put back here some results from Dunsky, their DER potential study in Ontario report, where they look at the technical and actionability of DER, so what they can actually provide in terms of contribution. And so if we're just looking at the achievability, well, they found that by 2032, DERs could provide 1.3 to 4.3 gigawatt of peak summer demand. And I think their actual forecast was along the line of 2025 or something like that. And between 1 and 3.6 gigawatt of peak winter demand for a similar I had it in my notes, but it's hidden. But I think that was roughly the forecasted peak winter demand. So they looked at the demand, so they didn't look necessarily at other periods, but nevertheless, it shows that it has some possible contribution. So why are we not integrating the flexibility of DER in long-term planning now, or why are we doing it in a simplified way? Because flexibility is complicated. It's not one value. It's something that varies with time. Of course, your smart thermostat controlling your electric baseboard heater, they don't have much to offer in the middle of July, right? So that flexibility varies with time, and it's also not only seasonal, it varies throughout the day, right? So it will need some time to react. It will have a ramping capacity. There's a maximum power that it can bring. It might have a rebound effect also, and there's also a maximum of time before it can provide the service again, right? So it's a number of characteristics that evolve with time, with season, and all that. But if you think about it, it's not that far from how we are currently including generators and storage units in planning, right? It has a capital and a marginal cost. It has an availability that varies with time. It has a nominal power. It has ramping up and down constraints. So it's not that different than how we include generators and storage. So if we can do that for those types of assets, maybe we can do it for load as well. So in conclusion, the long-term planning that we're currently doing is often based on the traditional grid mindset. Generation follows load. So the sum of the generation is the sum of the load plus the sum of the losses. But our modernized grid will have more DERs. So maybe it's time to shift a bit our mindset towards more of a load follows generation approach, or even better, sum of the resources equals 0. But that's not necessarily straightforward, and that also complexifies the problem considerably. So we need some methods to be able to do that in a reasonable way. Again, that doesn't complexify the problem too much. But it's still important to do it, because if we don't, we might overbuild infrastructure, or really not capture some elements that might be much cheaper than other options. And also that mindset of a sum of the resources equals 0 doesn't only apply to long-term planning, but also production cost model, as well as operational planning models. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Véronique, for the presentation. So we'll have time to discuss about very interesting topics. So before I move forward to the next presenter, so I would like just to remind you that Mentimeter is available if you have any question. And for sure, we can come back to the question period after we finish. So our next presenter is Amara. So she will explore how comprehensive, detailed, and balanced load forecasting will assist utility in targeting infrastructure investment and also preparing for the electrification. So, hand for Amara.
Thanks. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Amara. I'm an associate I'm an associate consultant with Dunsky Energy and Climate, and as mentioned, I'm going to be presenting some sort of key insights and practices that we've developed as we've been helping our clients with load forecasting and kind of trying to understand and prepare for the realities that electrification might bring to their systems. Just before I jump into that, I'll give a brief overview of Dunsky for any of you who might not know who we are. We are an energy and climate consulting firm really focused on one main mission, which is helping our clients to accelerate the clean energy transition. And we do this through a couple of key Okay, it seems to be stuck, so I'm not sure. But anyways, we do this through working in basically all of the key demand sectors, including buildings, transportation, and industry, as well as the supply side, so energy itself, and through a combination of analysis, including modeling, as well as, strategy, so really helping them to develop their plans and policies and programs. And we've been lucky to work for different clients across all provinces in Canada, as well as throughout much of the US. So I'm really excited to be able to share some of the insights from this work with you all today. I want to start off with kind of a brief overview of how utilities planners' perspectives on electrification may have evolved, taking the stages of grief as kind of an inspiration. So earlier on in 2016, it started off with kind of denial, thinking that this wasn't going to really be coming, or even if it was, impacts might be minimal. And then moving forwards in approximately 2021, where we saw more aggressive policy developments such as ZEV mandates and more of a obvious shift in the markets. There was sort of anger, maybe fear, convinced that our systems would not be able to accommodate this growth. And while there may be some people who are still stuck in this phase, I see more and more our clients are moving towards this phase of acceptance and recognizing that this is coming and we need to understand it and plan for it. But that also brings up many questions. What is going to be the pace and magnitude of electrification? What are going to be the impacts on my infrastructure? Where are these impacts going to be located? So this is really what I'm looking to focus on today. And I'm going to be walking through essentially 3 key insights for load forecasting practices. The first is to view load growth holistically. So it's really important to capture the combined impacts of multiple technologies, sectors, and segments in order to truly understand how system fundamentals may evolve. The second is to get granular. So load impacts are not going to be homogeneously distributed across a given service territory, and they might vary, and we might see more imminent and more significant impacts in certain pockets of the distribution system. And the last is to take a balanced approach which recognizes the need to highlight both the potential for unmitigated load impacts while also leveraging this to show where cost-effective investment in DERs and load management strategies could be made in order to mitigate these impacts. So diving into the first point, as I mentioned, it's important to really take into account all sectors, segments, and technologies, since load impacts will not be due to just one sector or segment. So even though load growth from EVs is often top of mind, heating electrification could be just as significant, particularly in jurisdictions which currently have limited electrification of heating and in colder climates. And going to a segment level, we also see, for example, load impacts will not be due to just passenger EVs, but in some systems or potentially subsets of systems where we see a higher concentration of commercial customers, maybe the potential for development of large charging depots, fleet charging impacts could actually overshadow passenger vehicles. And why it's important to understand this is really to see how system dynamics will evolve and have a complete picture. So for example, in this example here, we see the combined impacts of both EVs and heating electrification drive a shift from summer to winter peaking in this system as early as 2029. And if we were taking just one or the other technology in a silo, we might see this happening only 4 or 5 years later in maybe 2035 or even after. And this also impacts the actual load shape. So you can see that the combined impact of heating electrification and EVs create this kind of dual peaking system with 2 daily winter peaks, one in the morning, more driven by heating electrification, and one in the evening, more driven by EVs. And this was mainly focused towards winter peaking systems, but this is equally as critical in summer peaking systems and those which might be expected to remain summer peaking into the future. Here we see that the uptake of heating electrification and PV can actually help to offset some of those load impacts due to EVs. In areas where there's a high penetration of air conditioning, heat pumps can actually provide more highly efficient cooling, helping to reduce some of those summer peaks. And PV can also supply some of the energy during the hours, of course, when you have the sun shining. Diving into the second point, so taking into account local demographics and how these will impact the uptake of technologies and also load patterns is really important, especially at the distribution levels, to understand where these impacts are going to be concentrated. And there's sort of 3 main factors that we see driving the distribution of these technology uptake and load impacts within a service territory. The first being the kind of obvious one, so that is the actual market size and composition, for example, the number of residential versus non-residential loads and customers. The second is actually market saturation, where in areas where there's already an existing higher penetration of these technologies, It can drive a more fast uptake of additional technologies in the future due to networking effects. And the third is general market characteristics that are correlated with adoption propensity. So this could include income levels, or if we take the case of EVs, housing type, where customers that are in areas with a higher concentration of single-family homes are more likely to see earlier adoption of electric vehicles since they have easier access to garages and to install charging infrastructure, whereas we still need, some policy support to catch up for the multifamily homes and garage orphans. This is just a visual example of this distribution, so we can really do this across different levels depending on the client and the question that's trying to be asked, whether that's at the regional level, the substation level, or even down to the feeder level. And this is really just a visual way to highlight that there are going to be pockets of the distribution system that are more significantly impacted than others. And the relevance of trying to understand this is really from an infrastructure and planning perspective. So if we can see, which substations are more likely to see a higher impact earlier on, this can be really useful for planners to decide and target where they want to make their investments. So we might see, for example, accelerated impacts to certain substations where there's a higher impact of electrification, a higher uptake of electrification. On the other hand, there may be some areas where the local demographics or load patterns in that area mean that impacts are simply not that significant, and you don't need to necessarily accelerate your investment in that area. And this is kind of another visual example of this, where we have basically in the first column load growth on substations without EVs, and in the second column load growth with EVs. And there's a few different cases that are highlighted here. So in the first example, we see that investment in that substation to handle increased loading could be accelerated by up to 7 years due to electrification. In this case, we see maybe there's not necessarily an acceleration because even in the baseline, it was going to experience overloading. However, if you're looking at investing in that substation, you might want to future-proof it for the additional loading that's expected in later years due to electrification. And then finally, as I mentioned, just due to demographics and specific load patterns, there may be some areas where we don't see a significant impact due to electrification. And this really helps planners to assess both the pace and magnitude of these changes while also seeing where they need to target their investments and make decisions. This brings me to the last point, which is about, again, this balance between needing to both understand the unmitigated load impacts while also considering flexibility. So, our work and work that we've seen throughout the couple of days and throughout many different electrification and net zero studies show that, if unmitigated, particularly peak demand impacts of electrification will be significant, both system-wide or whether that's in more localized hotspots of the system. And while this may be, not always something that planners want to see, there's value in seeing this versus simply sort of embedding load management into your forecast from the beginning, because this can really give a complete picture of these potential impacts and the potential investment that might be needed if we don't invest in cost-effective alternatives like demand response and other DERs. So on the other hand of this, finally, we don't want to present only unmitigated impacts. We need to recognize that EVs, heat pumps, and battery-paired solar are all flexible loads that can be managed, controlled, and leveraged as distributed energy resources. And this can actually be a cost-effective solution to reducing peak demand and supporting to avoid or defer investments in infrastructure. So this is an illustrative example here where we see in the second graph some load management strategies have been deployed. The scale is kind of removed for confidentiality, but you can see that this is potentially on the order of several hundred megawatts or maybe even a few gigawatts compared to on the size of the system. So this can actually represent a pretty significant investment. So just to kind of recap on these three main points, it's really important to consider in load forecasting practices which are both holistic, so capturing the combined impacts of multiple technologies, sectors, and segments to have a complete picture of system dynamics, such as changes in peak season or changes to the load shape. Second, it's important to consider granularity. So load forecasts with a granular distribution of impacts can highlight the non-homogeneity of these impacts and support in planning investments at both the right place and the right time. And finally, having a balanced forecast which highlights both the potential for unmitigated impacts while also considering the potential for load management is essential for highlighting opportunities for cost-effective investment in DERs. And essentially, all of this taken together can empower utilities with valuable insights as they're looking to understand and plan for the realities of electrification and really making these investments and decisions in, again, the right place at the right time and choosing the most cost-effective solutions available to them. So that concludes my presentation, and looking forward to hearing from the other speakers and taking any questions after.
Thank you, Amara, for the presentation. A very interesting topic. I think the big challenge is data for this. So we're gonna move now to the third presentation. So Professor Taco and his student Pierre will present and will address the challenges of storage, trade, and also variable renewable energy for capacity expansion model. So they will also show some results regarding British Columbia case study. Thank you.
Thank you. So, yeah, so I'm Delta Plus Research Lab at Simon Fraser University in Sustainable Energy Engineering, and just sort of, that slide hasn't followed up yet, so it'll get there. That seems typical. Oh, there it is. So there's a little bit of a delay. That's slightly disconcerting, but that's okay. Quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. Just want to quickly talk about where I'm from and where we're from, the challenge that we're facing in terms of the system, which I think we all are aware of, but just reframe that again, and then talk about my research group and addressing interdisciplinary challenges and what we do there. And then I'm going to pass it over to Pierre, who will talk about some of the results, similar to what he put on the poster as well. So there's, you can also ask some questions there about some of those pieces. So I just want to first start with acknowledging that we're on the Anishinaabe Algonquin people's lands, and that most of this work happens in the lands of the Hanukkwanam, Squamish, and Salish-speaking people. So that's British Columbia, southwestern British Columbia, where I live. And I'm really happy to be able to live and work in that place, and also want to frame my work and work in sustainability as part of trying to address some of the inequities and colonization impacts that exist. So just, I like framing my work that way, and it keeps me thinking about, hopefully thinking about my work in a good way. So the challenge, and we've seen pictures like this before, but basically we've got 20% electricity, 80% fossil. It's starting to shift slowly. We can have more EVs on the system, but we need to figure out how to build out that 80% fossil into something that isn't fossil. We've had some presentations about CCS. We've talked about some DERs and how they can help with the system. But the real challenge is that we need 2 times more electricity to be able to do what we want to do. And that's with all these other pieces in place. So it's a really big challenge. And all of those new things that we need to build have to be low carbon. We know that that's the problem, and we know that we need to get there. A large part of that is transport, industry, those areas that aren't currently connected to the electric grid, and with electric vehicles and pieces like that, we're starting to make those pieces happen. So with that, and we've heard about this as well, I feel like I'm a little bit repeating what's happened in previous things. I might go through my part a little bit faster, which I think, since we're a little late anyways, that'll be fine. So challenges integrating variable renewables, so ramping concerns, shorter peaks. There's issues with forecasting. With a coal plant, you can forecast that you can turn it on, and you can run it, and then you can turn it off. With VRE, you can turn it on, and then the wind may or may not be blowing. And so there's a challenge with forecasting. And then also, as we build out large amounts of VRE, there's network congestion issues. We might have a huge amount of wind in northern BC, but that transmission line just isn't going to get it where we want to get it. So how do we deal with those different pieces? And so there's challenges with integrating these variable renewables. There's challenges with figuring out, as the previous speakers have talked about, how do we manage the load as a distributed energy resource? how do we forecast how that can work? How do we get those tools in place? How do we get the technology in place to piece those pieces together? And so the nice thing about all this is that there's good job security, but the bad thing is we've got to solve these problems, and hopefully soon, because my daughter and future generations really need this. We need to succeed with this to be able to get these things figured out. And most of what we've talked about is energy, but it really fits into the bigger sustainability question. So number 7 is energy. I assume everyone's seen the Sustainable Development Goals, but the interactions with all these other pieces is really a piece that I'm really interested in terms of how do we figure out how to move things forward, how do we model how to move things forward effectively while not causing issues in most of the other ones on this list. So figuring out 7, but then pushing a whole bunch of people into hunger and poverty, I'm not really interested in that. So how do we do this in a holistic way where we look at all these different pieces and put them together so that all of this moves forward in an effective way? And that's what my team at SFU is really trying to do, is piece the tools together to make those things happen. So my research group, comprehensive energy engineering and modeling solutions in the sustainability space, trying to support decision makers, model interactions between climate, land, energy, water, equity, and justice. So that's sort of the horizontal. A number of people have heard me say this before because I've talked to people. There's sort of the horizontal piece where I want to add energy and land and water and all those pieces into the system. And then sort of the data-driven, getting into some of the vertical in capacity expansion modeling, production cost modeling, some of the distribution system modeling as well, sort of that vertical piece, getting into those different pieces. Most of what we do is try and do that open source. So for transparent analysis, using open source tools that exist already, building on those where we need to, but and then trying to make sure that as much as possible, we put those things back out into the community. So we have this community of practice, which is part of the Energy Modeling Hub as well, is that community of practice, trying to make those pieces fit together. I feel like I already started talking about that a little bit. My outline's in the wrong place, that's okay. But I'll also note that it is a team of people. I get to stand up here and take credit for a bunch of things. I brought Pierre because he gets to... Apparently this slide moves itself along. But it's these people that do all the cool work in my group. But I get to come here and stand up and take credit for a lot of those things. That's also why I have Pierre here to show his work and piece those pieces together. Some of the specific research projects that we're involved with at LTE, so Osmosis Global and Clues Global. So there's an open source tool out there right now. You can go on to GitHub. Don't remember the exact URL, but if you search for Osmosis Global, it'll show up. And that is an open workflow. And you can go in there, you can type in the country you want to model, and you can press snake make go, and it will run that country for you. It has some terrible assumptions in it, so it'll do random things like throw solar all over the place, but it gives you a base model to start from. And so that Osmosis Global, that gives you that base model to start from, and then you can add other countries in and you can connect them together, and it's a starting point for a lot of that analysis. One of the things we're doing with that is trying to add that clues, the climate, land, and energy and water, so connect that land and energy water piece into that as well. What happens if we do biofuels? What does that do to the agricultural production in the country? Are you pushing crops? So study with Philippines, sugarcane for biofuels. You do that, you push the production of other crops into more marginal areas, and you reduce the production of that agriculture, and so you increase food prices. So there's all those interesting interactions and pieces. So Clues is one of the tools that I use internationally to take a look at some of those pieces. And then looking at equity and justice as well. So Clues is the land and energy water system, but some of the pieces that come out of that are some of those justice implications. If food prices go up, that's going to cause people to go into that no poverty, no hunger SDGs in that area and become challenging. So we've got this paper under review, hopefully published soon, about equity and justice in modeling. How do we bring those pieces together? How do we bring the modeling community and the planning and justice and energy transitions community together? How do we talk to each other? We had some really interesting meetings where we talked for an hour and we realized that we were actually talking about the same thing, but we had to come to the same words to get there. So some of that connecting those pieces together. And then we get down into the electricity system, substantial modernization required. We've had lots of discussion about this already as well. So I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. But basically, shifting from the current grid, where things are basically unidirectional, as we've seen, into a smart grid where we have these distributed resources that are contributing when they can. How do we piece those pieces together? Do a bunch of work internationally. I alluded to that earlier. So I do in-country development workshops. I've done that in a number of places. In January, I get to go to Guyana and Brazil, training and mentoring faculty at these different institutions, and working with the local communities to build the models for their analysis so that they can do that analysis themselves. It's not a consulting where I go in and then I charge them for doing the modeling, and then I charge them again for doing the next analysis, and then they want some other analysis, you charge them again. It's I go in to try and help them build the tools and the structures so that they can do the modeling for themselves. And then, so now we're going to focus down a little bit to get things ready for Pierre, because I'm actually going over time a little bit. So looking at decarbonization in BC, what we're doing with that is we've got a CLUES model for BC and a power system model for BC, and we're linking those so that we can have that capacity expansion, looking at land and water, and then deep into how the power system actually operates. And sort of linking that to get some good policy support for BC. I'm now going to hand it over to Pierre to talk about how that looked at for one specific piece of what we're doing with BC.
Thank you, Taco. I'll provide a bit of a lightning talk on some of our work on modeling in BC. Very nice. So first of all, we use Pipes@BC. Pipes@BC is a model built using the Python for Power System Analysis, which is an open source toolbox for simulating and optimizing modern power and energy systems. A model of BC's energy system, it's used to simulate the optimal dispatch and use of BC's energy assets, allowing to perform production cost modeling at an hourly resolution to better understand the usage of investments from BC Nexus, which is our capacity expansion model, built from the osmosis framework. However, we can also perform capacity expansion for a limited time horizon in PIPESA, and that will be the subject of today's talk for my behalf, to understand the optimal portfolio for a given scenario. So at this year's annual forum, we've brought a preliminary study of EV integration under various EV penetration levels and different charging strategies using Pipes@BC. The objective of this project for now is to identify the generation resources required to enable fleet electrification, to investigate the challenges and opportunities of fleet electrification. The charger currently used is the level 3 charger of 100 kilowatts. The uncoordinated strategy assumes when vehicles arrive at home, they charge immediately until they're full. The coordinated case assumes when they plug in, they can charge anytime between when they arrive home and when they leave for the next trip. And the V2G is the same as the coordinated case, except for now they can also discharge the grid, all dictated by the model. Getting into our results, so what we found for our EV integration study is at the 50% penetration level, we saw an investment of around 1.25 gigawatts of wind investment made across all three cases. There's slightly more, which isn't discernible in this plot, of 13 megawatts of wind in the uncoordinated case, but it's a marginal difference. So there's not much difference at a 50% penetration level. However, once we get to 100% penetration, that's where we see large differences. Looking firstly between the uncoordinated and coordinated case, we see a significant difference. There's 2.7 times more investment in the uncoordinated case compared to the coordinated or V2G case. And comparing from the coordinated case to the V2G case, they're actually identical, we found in our model results. There's no difference in investment, indicating that coordinated charging is sufficient, for the BC case at least, for EV penetration. One thing to note here is, in this model here, we don't take into account like behavior. So not everyone is going to necessarily charge when we want them to charge, even though from the modeling perspective, we do model it as an endogenous variable that the model can pick. So some further research is going to be needed there. But still, there's quite a large gap, even if some of that's closed by behavior. And looking into a bit more of understanding what's happening, I think the net load duration curve is a good piece of data for this. So looking at the coordinated and V2G cases here, and just to be clear, the net load duration curve here is the difference between load subtracting for run-of-river, wind, and solar assets, and in the case of V2G, also subtracting the discharging of the vehicles. The net load or residual load in this case must be then dispatched from dispatchable assets, which in BC are predominantly hydroelectric reservoirs. We see in the coordinated and V2G charging scenarios, they benefited by shifting charging from times of high net load to low net load. And we also see from the correlation that essentially what's happening is the time of VRE production is becoming more aligned with the charging in the coordinated case and V2G cases. And the investments here are predominantly made in the Peace region of BC. A few takeaways from Taco's part for our group. It's really about having open data and being transparent to allow decision makers better access to our assumptions and what our models actually can say and can't say. And then also trying to involve larger breadth into our model and be focused outside of just energy, but also including climate, land, water, and equity. And from the EV integration study, there's really just 2 points. One is in our particular case, we found that coordinated charging offered all the benefit compared to V2G, and then we also saw there definitely is a benefit in coordinated charging as compared to uncoordinated. That's everything. Thanks for your time today. Appreciate it.
So thanks, Pierre, for the presentation. So we're going to move now to the fourth presentation, the last one for this session. So I'm going to invite Mrs. Caroline Calwes, so she will give us some information and some focus on the implication on financial dynamics for the distribution network transformation. So welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be on this panel with my co-panelists, and it's a privilege to be here today. I come to you as the economic regulator of the electricity and natural gas sectors in Ontario. I am very comfortable in policy spaces. I'm really unfamiliar with modeling spaces, so I hope that the remarks I have for you today have some meaning for you. And what I thought I would do is put the Ontario system in context, in a policy context, and then talk about how we get a distribution system to show up. What does it take to have the distribution respond to the challenge that we have ahead? So let me start with that. At the OEB, we think about the pieces of the policy puzzle. And the first real one, in terms of chronology, was the ISO pathways work. And I know this conference has talked about that a few times over the course of the last 2 days. What was significant for us about this report, and for many in the Ontario sector, was that although distribution systems were acknowledged, they weren't considered. They were referenced in passing, but largely left out of the puzzle. And so while the IESO identified a massive need for electricity, for energy, and for capacity, it didn't look to the distribution system to respond to that. And that's not a criticism. They have a grid-wide view, they have a bulk system perspective. They wouldn't necessarily think about the distribution system to respond to the problem. And yet the problem is so enormous, I think we have to ask, what can they bring to the table? And what's significant as well is that in addition to the need, and even if you take it as indicative, and you're the modelers, I'll leave the right model to you and to debate. But even if you take the need as indicative, then look at the cost and take that as indicative. And what's significant about this is that this doesn't include distribution system costs. So we know there are significant investments required, and we need to think about how the distribution system contributes to that. The second piece of the puzzle from an OEB perspective is Ontario's Powering Ontario's Growth report. And so this, in our view, sets a significant policy context within which we all work, and it identifies no regrets actions, things that need to move forward now to address the need in the future. But it too is light on how the distribution system can respond to this need. It nods to it, and I've included a statement from the report on this slide. But again, it points to such enormous need in the future. And this this report is placed in the context of economic growth in Ontario and population growth, the political priority of housing, and the economic investment in EVs. And so when we look at these policy pieces, as the regulator, we think there's got to be more coming to the table. We have a huge net zero challenge. We know demand is increasing, whatever the number may be. We're going to have to deal with affordability. And all of that fits into what we rather easily call the energy transition, the major challenge we all face, and that we're all trying to solve. So, is distribution the solution? Well, I don't know if it's the solution, but I think it can make a contribution. So how then do we get distribution to show up, to respond to this challenge? And what I thought I would do with a focus on the costs element of the theme of this panel is talk about how we pay for distribution. So what I'll do in this section is talk a little bit about the framework we use today, give you some indication of the new tools that are trying to come to the table, and then talk about where we're going. And so in Ontario today, the distributors are paid through the renewed regulatory framework. That's what we call the model. And it has a rate-setting piece. It requires distributors to think about planning, and that's where your work becomes so important. And it also requires distributors to think about performance measurement. How are they serving the customers who pay for their services? And they require, through regular applications to the OEB, to report on all those things. The most typical approach is what we call fourth generation incentive regulation. That's a 5-year cost of service model where utilities come in, lay out a 5-year plan, and commissioners test through evidence, both from the utilities and from interveners, whether the plan is solid and establish a rate on that basis. There's also a model that we call custom incentive regulation. That's where utilities are less bound by the specific requirements of the fourth gen model and can propose new innovative ways to pay for what they want to do and propose new ways of doing what they want to do. And then there's another model called annual incentive regulation, and that's just a sort of a 1-year bump up based on inflation. Now, that's the traditional model, and most regulators in North America use some version of that with more or less tweaks. We know that it has advantages and that it has disadvantages. So on the plus side, it's a model that is generally considered fair. Costs are allocated amongst consumers fairly transparently, fairly predictably. There's a consumer protection element. That's the lens through which we commissioners look at rate applications. But we know that there are criticisms of the model. And those criticisms include undue regulatory burden, that it requires too much of utilities, it's not responsive enough, it takes too long to get done. There are also criticisms about the efficiency of the incentives. Do they really capture what how distributors should be investing in their systems? And there are challenges around encouraging innovation. And people say that that the model doesn't respond to innovation very effectively. Now, the model I laid out for you isn't the only way that the distribution system can respond. There are DER incentives that utilities can leverage to bring those sorts of resources, and they're listed on this slide. And again, there are criticisms and advantages to both to these as well. But I wanted to put these in front of you to say the picture I showed you of how we approach rate regulation isn't the whole story. There's more to it. And there's too much to go into here. But know that there are other elements in play. What I think is most significant today is where we're trying to open the doors to allow new resources, to allow distributors to bring new resources to bear to solve the challenge that I laid out for you at the outset. So one thing that's happening is some work between the Ontario Energy Board and the Independent Electricity System Operator that looks at how incentives can be used to better approach DERs and bring more to the table. This work is underway now, and there will be more to come on it. And if you participate in the joint session between the OEB and the DER and the ISO on the DER front, then you've heard about this work before. But it's getting close, so I'm excited about it. You may also know that the OEBs recently, earlier in 2023, introduced some new incentives to try to encourage distributors to bring more DERs to the table. And what we've tried to do with these mechanisms is say, hey, tell us about, tell us how you would like to be remunerated for them through either a performance-based mechanism, a savings sharing mechanism with customers, or a margin on costs. And so if the traditional rate setting mechanism doesn't work for you, look at these and give us a proposal. And we'll work with you to try to make it work for you. So that's where we are today. But I think everyone knows that it is lacking. There needs to be more. So what do we know that's next? Well, immediately, we at the OEB will be looking to the Electrification and Energy Transition Panel, the work headed by David Colley. And I think many in Ontario are very interested in that work and where it looks to DERs and to the distribution sector to respond to the challenge. It will be interesting, I think, to see whether that work picks up some of the openings, I would suggest, that the ISO left in its Pathways report and that the province left in its Powering Ontario's Growth report. And I also wanted to mention some work that's happening both at the OEB and at the IESO on distribution system operating models. And it seems some days that everybody's talking about this, and it seems some days that this is the only thing that people are talking about. But I do point to this because I think as we think about how the distribution sector can respond to the challenge that we have ahead, this may be one way to get more assets to the table, to take advantage of some of the resources that distributors can bring. And so this is the forefront of work and the creative thinking that organizations like mine are trying to do now, and I'm sure many of you are as well. And I'll look forward to hearing more about the modeling that you're doing in that space in the coming years. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, for the presentation, for giving us very important information about the financial aspect. So as I told you before, we have the Mentimeter. Okay, it's just displayed, and we can also ask your question through the two microphones that are available in the room. So maybe to start and also to create some bridges between all presenters. My question for all of you, so how could forecasting models help the integration of distributed energy resources and storage system, and particularly how it can reduce the cost of the integration? Maybe I will start with you, Amara, that are expert in the forecasting. So.
Sure. So about how it can support integration of DERs and reduce cost. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think this kind of relates to the third point that I wanted to highlight through my presentation, is that if you use load forecasting to really understand both the unmitigated impacts and the cost that this would take on an infrastructure side, this can actually really highlight sort of the business case for DERs and how this could be more cost effective and also, in some cases more timely, given the lead times that we're looking at for some of the distribution and transmission system infrastructure. And so this can kind of be an incentive and a business case for integrating DERs. Also, I mean, as Véronique highlighted in her presentation, really looking at the hourly level at least is kind of essential for understanding how these can integrate in the system and balance different, variable renewable generation and demands. So I think these are two key pieces of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm. Véronique, how about you? How do you think that forecasting could help you, like as an integrator for the grid for the distribution energy system?
Yeah, in planning, I think the forecasting, yes, is important, but to be able to forecast it well, you need to be able to know the characterization of the flexibility that you have, so how much flexibility you can actually get from the different types of distributed energy resource. So you need to know that to be able to forecast what you're load can
And
look like.
you are talking about the forecasting from the load side as well as from the renewable energy side? Because it depends on the profile of the load, so you
Yeah.
can look which kind of renewable energy resources could match to create your net load that you have.
Match or not, because I think the DR have to adapt to the condition of the network. So if we're focusing, let's say, on the load part of the DR, understanding what they can do, how they can shift at different times of the day, that need to be implemented in the forecast, so we can achieve that sum of resources equals 0 in the planning.
Yeah, thank you. Pierre, you mentioned that in your model that you have considered like uncoordinated charging and also smart charging. And at the end, you mentioned that as a like the next stage, it includes the stochasticity in your model. And do you think that getting this data is easy for you, to get the arrival time, departure time, and also the initial state of charge for those vehicles, so you can ensure coordinated charging while also taking into account all those uncertainties?
Yeah, I think taking into account all those uncertainties would be pretty tough. I know, like, the model currently runs in about 19 hours with the deterministic modeling. So I think adding stochasticity in a single model run would be probably computationally too much. However, I think there are options to apply simplification methods where maybe we assume, like in this study, we assume 100% of the vehicles are all charging one way. We could assume 20% aren't available, some percentage are just available for coordinated charging, and then some of them can do V2G, and playing with the mix a bit more. I think those are solutions. Just figuring out the right ratios of that is the more difficult part. Maybe a survey would be a way, or also looking at literature out there and see what's already available. But I think a full-out stochastic optimization model is probably computationally infeasible at this point, especially with running 8,760 hours.
Very good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks.
Yeah. So my question more, because you mentioned sustainability, which is great, and you mentioned also like combining water with energy, which is also great. And we know that a lot of research is going on the greenhouse and how to integrate like more greenhouses with the renewable energy resources. So you think that from the agriculture field, is it feasible to think that we can have also buildings that are integrating like greenhouses in the top, so we can even participate, increase the flexibility for the grid, but also provide some agriculture like locally?
Interesting thought. I hadn't thought about putting greenhouses on top of buildings, but yeah, so I think using our existing building stock for distributed energy resources, so solar panels on the roofs, for example, is the typical one. But yeah, potentially you could have vertical farms and building that type of infrastructure as well with buildings that could then change the structure of things. The modeling I do is really big picture. Like, we're modeling a country, so we don't get down to individual buildings very often. But that is how that works. How do you? There's been some really interesting studies on how do we put solar panels on farms. As things get hotter, those solar panels actually provide shade, so you can actually grow the vegetables better because of the solar panels that are on those farms. So there's really interesting things like that then the modeling gives you that broad stroke idea of how where the system stresses will be, and then you can look for those technologies that then can sort of address those system stresses and see how that changes your results.
Yeah, nice. So my last question, well, for the first round for you, Caroline, is motivation. It's very important to motivate customers, because we know, I'll give you an example, in Quebec, we have some winter peaks, we have some flat pricing, which is flat, so we don't motivate, people are not very motivated to change their behavior, especially in this period of time. So how we can create some financial models so we can motivate those customers that are really hard to motivate, and how we can ensure their implication in the grid?
Thank you for that question. Making the link between energy usage and customers is so important, and it's challenging. Certainly time of use pricing and various models of time of use pricing can assist with that. In Ontario, we talk a lot about customer choice, giving people options about how they pay for electricity to better meet their specific needs. And so I think we're making some good progress on that. We're seeing some really interesting modeling coming out of California that looks at how rate design can be changed to be more responsive to customers and help them support the grid better. So lots of stuff happening on that front. I don't have a definitive answer for you, but
Thank you. Thank you. We can move now maybe to the Mentimeter. I will start by a question for Taco. So what do you mean exactly by coordinated approach? So from your side, I think maybe this is a question for Pierre. What do you mean by coordinated approach in your slides?
Yeah, so a coordinated approach meant that when the vehicle arrived at home, we're assuming it charges or it plugs into the charger, and then the grid operator would coordinate when it charges, but they would know how much it needs to be charged by the next trip, which is a lot of information sharing, of course, and a lot of like perfect foresight assumption, which isn't necessarily clear or possible in the real world. And that's where a lot of our modeling is really optimistic, like the gap you see between the capacity, but it does show there is a lot of value that you can get. It's just a matter of trying to identify how to get that.
Question for you, Amara. What cost impacts does disaggregation have for an identical aggregate process of electrification within a utility network? So like regional grid and how significant are the non-linearity that you got?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't have any numbers to quote for you, but I can speak to this a little bit. So I mean, part of the goal of the disaggregation is to see not only to see a change in cost, but really to target the place and time of your investment. So if you have, a load forecast for a given territory and you just kind of spread this evenly across all infrastructure, you might not see, these targeted hotspots where you maybe can't wait, 5 or 10 years to invest in that infrastructure or to do some DERs or DR programs. You might need to do it in 2 years or 3 years. So I think the timing piece is really one part that is like more important to consider in the disaggregation. And then on the cost side, I mean, the point is not really to highlight like a higher or a lower cost, but also to really just see, I mean, without disaggregating and seeing where the system is affected, you really don't have an understanding of what the cost could be. And then again, not really to make it more expensive, but to show where you might need to invest and then consider all of the options available to you, whether that is new infrastructure, whether that is a DR program, whether that is DERs, and really considering all of this together.
Yeah, thank you. But also, I think you show different level of forecasting, and the big challenge is data. So how we can make sure that you use this granular prediction while we don't have enough data for the forecasting, which is a big challenge.
Yeah, so the data question is also of course very key and something that we're always thinking about when we do this work. So as I presented in the sort of brief overview of factors we consider, there does need to be some data behind this. Typically, we are able to get data on most of these factors, whether it's from clients that collect their own data about where EVs are located and this type of thing, or and data on their different customers, or whether that's from publicly available data sources such as census data, etc. But depending on the level of data that is available for that region, whether from the client or publicly, we do have to be careful about tuning the granularity of the disaggregation to the granularity of the data, so as not to create false precision. So I'm not going to disaggregate down to the level of individual customers because I simply don't have that information to do that. And if we did want to do that, it would be more of a stochastic problem at that point when you get into like really individual houses, for example. But yeah, the data is really something key to consider and to really tune the granularity in line with that.
Yeah, thank you. Question for Veronique. Enabling two-way communication for demand response, the grid will be more exposed to a cyber attack. So have you done any work or on cybersecurity to protect the grid?
Yes, so our team, the Renewable Energy Integration team, we're not looking at the cybersecurity issues. There's another group or a few other groups, however, in the government that are. I can't recall the name, but if the person's interested, I can certainly search for that. And there are also some universities that tackle that problem, but we were looking at that.
Yeah, maybe 3 minutes left. So we have a question for Caroline. Do any of of your many distributed energy resource incentive mechanisms stand out in terms of their success, popularity, and efficiency?
They are so new, they have not yet been tried. So I am eager to see them tested and to see how they work and whether they work and to make them better. So
Okay.
tell your utility colleagues that we're ready.
Same question to you, Caroline. How can regulators incent distribution companies to come to the table with real plan? So can the regulator mandate models with challengeable assumption in statically?
That's where the work of modelers and forecasters is so important, because that becomes evidence that can be filed with the OEB in a rates hearing or in an incentive hearing, so that commissioners can test whether it makes sense to make the investment that utilities want. And that work, the work that you do, is so critical for that.
Yeah. I have a question for you, Professor Tako. We talk about distributed energy resources, but the most important question, who will manage those distributed energy resources in real time? Assume we have 1 million of distributed energy resources in the future.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really interesting question. And I think there's the who will manage, which I think is, you either have to have a price signal that goes down and that manages it sort of implicitly as a market, or you need some central coordination, which was where the sort of cybersecurity type thing comes in, because people controlling appliances in people's houses, there's some challenges there for sure. I think the related question to that is, who has the ability to take advantage of those incentives? There's a lot of evidence that, for example, in California, the people who get to install solar panels are the people who own their house and have the money to do so, and they get all the benefits from that. And the costs of that on the grid and the bigger system, the system has to accept that energy, and the costs of that are then distributed among everyone else who are not the rich people who own their own houses. And so there's a real challenge with how do you, and it's actually a price challenge. Our energy is too cheap, so these price signals are very hard. For those people who are rich, 1 cent a kilowatt hour is not very significant. So it's a few dollars on an electricity bill per month. It's not going to cause incentives for the people who use the most energy. But that 1 cent per kilowatt hour for those people who are not rich, it can be a really significant challenge for them. But they don't have the capital and the ability. They may not live in their own house. They may rent a place. They may not have the ability to install the technologies that allow them to avoid that cost. And so there's a really odd incentive challenge there, which I think the regulators have to think about, is the energy is too cheap and it's too expensive.
Yeah, I think you mentioned equity is very important, and also equity in the electrification itself. When you talk about electrifying the grid, so where to put distributed energy resources is very important to take into account the equity issue, so they can be on some geographical location that are really suitable for those communities. So thank you very much. I think we still have 22 minutes, maybe a last question.
20 seconds over.
Yeah, almost. One last question about the coordination, because you mentioned also one of the important, Veronique, the coordination between also the distribution system and the transportation system. We know that in case we have some distributed energy resources, they will be more visible for distribution system. How could transmission system could benefit from this, from the integration of distributed energy resources in the distribution system? Operation side, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it needs to. Yeah. Telling me. There we. Yeah. So, on an operation perspective, how can the distribution side help the transmission side? Yes, it needs to evolve so that distribution can provide services to the bulk grid for sure. Models need to evolve to be able to do that, and it's a change of paradigm, and it's a big question.
Yeah,
I don't have an answer.
It's a big one. We still have it, maybe for the next year. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Very interesting, and thank you everyone for for the listening. So we hope to see you all next year. Thank you.
Thank you.